Medical Affairs of MGI Pharma Incorporated and was instrumental in bringing several biotechnology and biopharmaceutical products to the market between 1983 and 1999. In addition, he developed new drug therapies for cancer patients undergoing radiation therapy for head and neck cancer, and also for patients with autoimmune diseases, including Sjogren's syndrome. Dr. Muscoplat currently serves as president of the UMOR company and holds an Ignite Presidential Leadership Endowed Chair. He also holds positions as adjunct professor of medicine in the medical school and professor of food science and nutrition in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences. He is actively conducting clinical research with faculty in endocrinology and food science and nutrition regarding vitamin D malabsorption syndromes. Dr. Muscoplat received his bachelor's in chemistry in 1970 with a minor in mathematics and his PhD in veterinary microbiology in 1975 from the University of Minnesota. He did postdoctoral training at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. Incidentally, I first met Dr. Muscoplat after I myself gave grand rounds on vitamin D deficiency a number of years ago, and that began several important projects that we're working on together. So I'm very pleased to ask him today to speak for us here in the Department of Medicine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sibley. Very nice to be here today, and I'll just get started right away. So my talk is about new drug therapies, how academia and industry together can find the Holy Grail. And those of you that are paying attention to the pharmaceutical industry realize that, new drug approvals are plummeting, almost like a bottomless pit. The costs to develop a new drug are skyrocketing, and the approval rate is sinking. But just as Shalmar said, if you've heard of the UMOR Park project, I'm currently president of that university for-profit corporation. I work part-time in the tech transfer office, and we just started a new initiative, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk, the Committee for Pharmaceutical Development, where we're providing seed money to faculty who have laid promising pre-commercial ideas. I was a former dean, and I spent almost 20 years in the drug industry. I do want to make a point to tell you a little bit about my financial disclosures. With Dr. Sibley and another colleague, we started a for-profit company to develop a vitamin D transdermal product for cystic fibrosis patients. I'm working as a consultant to another faculty startup called Curium Therapeutics, developing a genetically altered salmonella typhimurium for cancer treatment, and I consult for a venture capital fund in California called Burl & Company. And I'm not going to talk about off-label uses of any drugs. But what I'd like to do today is talk about, or have you understand with me, the origins of pharmaceutical discoveries, either in the academy or in the private sector, something about the current state of drug development, better understand the role of partnerships between the academy and industry, and how they're going to be much more important in the future, understand the costs, risks, and timelines inherent in pharmaceutical research, understand how the university can leverage our core research functions to improve the ultimate commercial success of our faculty's inventions, and to highlight 3 new programs here at the University of Minnesota. But one question Dr. Sibley asked me to address is, why do we care? I mean, why do we care about pharmaceuticals? Aren't they something that's done by the private sector? Well, why do we care? Because universities can have a more pivotal role in pharmaceutical developments in the future. Because I hope you'll understand shortly that they're not coming out of the private sector. Universities are the people to provide the missing link. The link in the private sector was lost about 1980, and the rate of discovery started to plummet. And we can provide the missing link to fill the critical holes in drug development and improve patient care. And we can be rewarded, we, the academy, can be rewarded by innovative scholarship and through significant financial rewards both to individuals and to the institution. My only New England Journal article in my life came about from research that was discovered at a university and led to a drug approval for head and neck cancer patients. And so even my own scholarship came out of the private sector, which wouldn't have happened without an academic beginning. But let me kind of frame the perspective. Gary Pisano is a business professor at Harvard Business School, wrote a couple years ago For most of the time since World War II, the drug industry was the single most profitable private sector enterprise. It was more profitable by every measure: return on equity, sales. It had the ability to charge high prices, had long product life cycles, had blockbuster drugs, and high productivity, none of which are true today. The big pharma business model is broken. All those four pillars of the drug industry that started in about 1950 probably ended in the mid-80s or 90s, and none are true any longer. And so the pharmaceutical development system, as you thought you knew it, is broken and needs fixing. And if you look at this graph, you can see the spending for pharmaceutical development is the purple squares. They've been rising steadily since the early 90s, but the bar chart shows the number of approvals. So spending has tripled, and productivity has either stayed the same or dropped by 30 or 40%. Not necessarily a good trend. And this beige area in the middle is called the gap. That's the innovation gap, where more money has not led to greater discoveries. And if you were to take a plot and say, what's the new molecule drug output per dollar expended, that's a bottomless pit. I mean, more money has resulted in fewer new molecules approved by FDA. So this is from 1970 to 2003, more money didn't solve the problem. And if you all remember Moore's Law, that Gordon Moore at Intel Corporation said chip speed doubles every 18 months to 2 years. That's been true since the 1960s. In the pharmaceutical industry, we have the inverse of Moore's Law, that pharmaceutical productivity gets worse by tenfold every 30 or 40 years. And this graph is new drugs approved per $1 billion expended over the last 60 years. I mean, you wouldn't want to go try to say, I'm going to solve the world's problem by being a drug company in the same old way. If you're going to be a drug company, you have to have a new model. If you look at this graph that says the cost of drug development has grown at an annual compound rate of 13.3% since 1950, based on 12 independent studies, pretty soon it will cost an infinite amount of money to develop a drug, or the number of approvals will asymptotically go to zero. If you look at trends in attrition about drug development projects since about 1990, you can see, you can't read this, but I'll tell you what it is. This is preclinical research projects are failing somewhere above 60% and rising. Our phase 1 studies were about washing out somewhere between 25 to 30% in 1990, and now are washing out at about 50%. Phase 2 studies were washing out about 40%, are now about 70%. Phase 3 studies are about 50% failing, and submissions to FDA are getting rejected at about 20 or 30%. It's a crisis of pharmaceutical development. Pharmaceutical development cycles. In the 1980s, it was the blue line. It took about 7 or 8 years to develop a drug, and you had about 10 to 15 where it was profitable and cost about $200 million. In 2010, this investment period grew to 15 years, $1 billion, and you only had about 7 or 8 years of product life cycle. So you've all seen this graph in many different ways. It says you take 5 to 10,000 chemicals, screen them, 250 enter preclinical, 5 enter clinical, 1's approved by FDA, and it takes 15 years. Phase 2 failures in the last 3 years, about 50% of phase 2 studies failed due to efficacy, about 20% fail due to safety. 70% of phase 2 studies wash out. Phase 3 studies, if you look at this right-hand pie chart, about 66% of phase 3 studies in the last 3 or 4 years have failed for efficacy and 20% for safety. Not a good bet. Phase 3 studies are the single most expensive step. So you have 80% or 70% of pharmaceuticals get to the last step and fail. The single most expensive step. I'll tell you something now, that if you're going to fail, you want to fail early. You don't want to wait till the last step and fail. Fail early and often is what my friend Steve Burrell says at a venture fund in San Francisco. So to summarize, 60 to 70% of phase 3 failures are because the drug doesn't meet the primary endpoint of efficacy. So we need to solve that problem in phase 2A studies. Don't take something into phase 2B or phase 3 unless you know absolutely that it works. And 70% of drugs that are now launched into the market don't meet their primary estimates for sales, meaning their commercial failures. They didn't wash out because they didn't meet a statistically significant or clinically significant endpoint. They washed out because they didn't get prescribed by doctors or they didn't get paid for by payers. If you look at some data by Steve Paul, who's now at the Weill Medical Center as former head of drug development at Lilly, he says that the industry is investing more than 3 times as much as 10 years ago with 40% as many new products. Phase 2 timelines have doubled and phase 3 timelines increased by 50%. The number of new molecular entities approved per $1 billion is 50-fold worse than 30 years ago. And so if you look at the data, most people have no idea that there's only, since the beginning of the FDA, there's only been 1,268 new molecules approved. 131 of those are biotech or biopharmaceuticals. We make no more drugs than we did 50 years ago. We all think that the biotech industry has been gangbusters, but believe me, it's not taking off. It's not been successful. If you invested in a mutual fund of all known biotechnology companies in the United States since 1978, you would have been better off investing in a Minnesota municipal bond. There are 4,300 companies engaged in drug innovation. Only 255 have ever registered a drug. Only 35 have existed for the entire length of the pharmaceutical industry, and of those, only 6 are big pharmas. In fact, only 35 companies have existed for the entire length of the industry as we know it, and 29 of the 35 are not even big pharmas, saying that you can be successful as a startup. And 21 companies produced half or 600 some of all the drugs approved since 1950. It's really startling when you think about it. You can look at the graph of new drugs approved or the cumulative. It's kind of becoming a sad state of affairs, and the industry now looks at commercial risk and regulatory risk with greater fear than scientific risk. I'm not sure that's wise. I think the problem is on the scientific risk side and the proof of concept, because if you do a good job of proof of concept, proof of relevance, and deal with good science, you won't have the commercial and regulatory risk, but that's my opinion. If you look at this graph, it's the same graph you saw a minute ago about cumulative R&D spending. But it's deceptive when you look at it. The industry is spending $40 or $50 billion a year. But it's now all being directed towards, most of it's being directed towards phase 3 studies. If you take the top 10 pharmaceutical companies, they have almost 250 phase 3 studies underway. And phase 3 studies cost about 90% of the cost of developing a drug. If they're taking all their money and putting it on phase 3 studies, it means they're not spending money on phase 2, they're not spending money on phase 1, they're not doing late-stage preclinical, and that means the pipelines of big pharmaceutical companies are going dry, and they'll be dead in the next 5 or 10 years, in my opinion. And also, the era of Me Too drugs is ending. There was a time when you could take Prilosec and convert it to Nexium and still make $5 billion, or Celexion, Lexapro, or Neurontin, Telyrica. But lately, that Me Too model no longer works. Doctors don't prescribe it very often. There are some exceptions. And the payers don't pay. If you take Imitrex to Trexamit, that didn't work. Coreg to Coreg controlled release doesn't work. Effexor to Pristic didn't work. So they became pharmaceutical failures despite spending $500, $600, $700, $800 million. Not a good strategy. There's a landmark paper, and I think everybody who wants to read something about drug development should read this paper by Dan Von Hoff, who wrote it when he was at the University of Texas San Antonio, now at TGen in Phoenix. The title of the paper was, "There are no bad anti-cancer agents, only bad clinical trial designs." He wrote this in Clinical Cancer Research, and he said the paper was about why compounds don't make it. he says attention is not paid to mechanisms of action and proof of concept, the uncoupling of preclinical from clinical development and not focusing on medical relevance. And he drew this chart. Discovery, clinical testing, a crisis, and people try to start over. And he coined this term pharmacopoptosis, and we all know in this room about apoptosis, when your cell dies. But he said after you spend 10 years or 15 years and $1 billion and your drug dies, that's pharmacopoptosis. It's a brilliant paper, and I would email it to anybody who wants it. So you've all seen the definition of insanity in many different ways, and Einstein has one. But the definition of insanity, it takes 16 years to develop a drug, spend $1 billion and to mostly fail. That's insanity. And if you look at the top of this slide, we've all seen this slide that says, I borrowed this from Bruce Blazer and Bob Schumacher. Basic research leads to discovery, screening, preclinical, phase 1, 2, 3, and approval. If you believe that, I got a bridge for you, or I got some ice to sell you in Alaska. That it doesn't work like that in real life. Those of us who, raise your hand, have been in the pharmaceutical industry, pharmaceutical development looks more like this diagram of the Afghanistan counterinsurgency strategy than it does to look at the linear model of phase 1, 2, 3, and approval. Drug development is fraught with difficulty. It's fraught with setbacks and interdependencies. It's the ultimate team sport. Nobody can do this alone. And so I want you to think about that. It's complex. You need basic science. You need preclinical science, pharm, tox, clinical science, statistical analysis, manufacturing, GMP, GLP, regulatory experts. Nobody does it alone, and it looks a little bit like that. I've developed a couple drugs, and I could have drawn this from memory. But there is a future here. How many people have seen the movie Moneyball? Okay, you need to go see the movie Moneyball to figure out the future of drug development. How the Oakland Athletics were able to have the best team in baseball by spending the least amount on players. I won't go into that, but the Oakland Athletics had half as much cost per win as the Chicago White Sox. They paid attention to putting players on base, to getting doubles and singles, and not going for the blockbuster. A walk is as good as a hit. A double is twice as good as a single. And they bought players that could make it to first base. And the drug industry has to follow this example. We need to get on base. We need to get into the clinic. We need to make sure our phase 2A programs work. If it doesn't work, go back. Don't go to phase 2B. Go back to phase 2A. The other thing that's happening in the industry is that we're losing about $60 billion worth of annual revenues to patent expirations. And the names of those drugs are those that most of you use: Lipitor, Plavix, Singulair, Zyprexa, Effexor, and a few others. And the drugs that are projected to come onto the market in the next 5 years only total about $40 billion, if they make it, if they're successful. If they follow the same success rate of the last 10 years, they won't make that $40 billion. So the industry is falling off a cliff. Pfizer has got their research facility on the market, a 700,000 square foot facility up for sale. And that's kind of just the early vision of the iceberg as to what's happening. The forces acting on the industry are rising R&D. Too few new chemical entities. College pharmacy people, that's your job. They need new chemical entities. Longer development times, shorter exclusivity. 30% of drugs are failing for safety, and pricing pressures from all the payers. On the other side, we have new approaches to R&D, better knowledge, better equipment. We have better science, biological breakthroughs. We have an aging population that provides opportunity, and many emerging economies around the world are starting to buy pharmaceuticals. Those of you that thought the biotech industry was the savior and was going to make all the money, that hasn't worked. On average, as I said a minute ago, returns have been poor. Take a mutual fund. Of all the biotech companies, you would have been better to buy a municipal bond. And maybe even the returns are negative. Now, if you would have bet on the 4 or 5 that made it, you would have had an enormous return. But in general, as the aggregate of the industry, the returns have not been well. and the industry is underperforming. Pedro Caracas was head of drug development at 3 different firms, Glaxo, Warner, Lambert, and Burroughs Wellcome. And he wrote a wonderful opinion piece, which I'll send anybody who wants it, that says the large pharmaceutical companies need to rid themselves of the self-deception of being great. They need to get rid of their discovery, get rid of their early development, and focus on acquiring products from people who know how to make them. Focus on acquiring products. Now, we are a source of that. Other small companies. There's a wonderful paper by Stephen Paul about how to improve R&D productivity, and that's the grand challenge. We're part of that solution. And Stephen Paul came up with one of these Moneyball formulas. You know, he kind of made a formula that calculates work in progress, probability of technical success, commercial value, reduce the cost of each preclinical and clinical step, and reducing cycle times. Instead of taking 4 years for us to phase 3, if you did it in 3.5 or 3 1/4, it's worth a huge amount of money. If you didn't take anything in the phase 2B that wasn't dynamiting phase 2A, you could get rid of half the failures. So I can't do the math here because I forgot how to do that, but you get the idea that you have to optimize everything. Your R&D efficiency of inputs, more affordable drugs, less costly R&D, more medical relevance. Value per launch, number of shots on goal, number of approvals, number of drugs on first base. That's all this formula says. Cost to discover and develop a new molecular entity has got a lot of steps. You need target to hit ratios. You need to decrease that cycle time, increase throughput. It's to lead optimization, probability of success, preclinical phase 1, 2, 3. You need to reduce the cost of every step. At some steps you need to stop. A lot of small companies that only have one drug need to keep it going because if they don't take it forward, they'd cease to exist. But more often than not, that's a mistake because they wind up spending money that doesn't yield. Stephen Paul developed this nomogram that says, kind of calculates how many drugs you have to take into phase 1 to get out of phase 2 that get to registration. So if you're dealing with 90% translation from phase 2 to 3, that's pretty good, but we're down about 50%. So we need to raise that up because you're going to have the unexpected failure or the unexpected side effect that occurs 1 in 50,000, like an anaphylactic shock or something from antibiotics that you see that happen. They don't appear till 3 or 4 years after they're in the market, and a few people die. That's something that you really can't test for. But if it's going to be me too, if it's going to not knock your socks off in early phase 2, it shouldn't go forward. The key to success is reducing late-stage attrition. Steve Burrell of Burrell & Company says, fail early and often. Better to knock off a half a dozen phase 1 drugs than to fail in phase 3. Maybe better to knock off 20 phase 1s than to fail in phase 3. Stephen Paul says you need to focus on the sweet spot. Proof of concept. Early phase 2. You have dynamite preclinical, but many of the animal models we have don't really correlate with human outcomes, particularly in oncology. You know, shrinking a tumor in an animal doesn't correlate in very many cases with testing in the clinic. So rather than think about this gigantic funnel of compounds going in that are going to go to phase 3, have the proof of concept that early phase 2 be your gatekeeper. Don't take anything forward unless it knocks your socks off in an early phase 2 study. But really, in order to do this right, we need a new R&D model. The industry has been operating on this closed source competitive model where big companies did everything themselves. Maybe occasionally in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, they acquired a molecule from somebody else. But they kept it all in-house. They said, we're going to develop it ourselves and make all the money. That doesn't work, as I hope I've convinced you now. That doesn't work. So the industry is moving to this open source or pro-competitive model, where it's better to have a small percentage of a lot of success than a large percentages of no success. So we're seeing companies develop hundreds of partnerships. I think I was at Johns Hopkins a couple months ago with Vadim and Eric Dudak and Derek Hook. And Hopkins has 20 industry partnerships, all at the pre-competitive level. They're not working in a space that there's great conflict of interest. They're working at the discovery phase. And many companies have literally hundreds of partnerships in the discovery realm. And so that's in the open source pre-competitive arena. So there are these areas that are competitive, and it's tough for universities to deal in the competitive space. It's fraught with conflict of interest. Those of you that do consult or start up companies like Dr. Sibley and I and others, you got to worry about these conflict of interest forums and be careful. Bad things happen if you don't. But if you work at the pre-competitive discovery phase, you have a lot more latitude. And if we can form lots of blanket agreements, I talked to Novartis and UCSF, they have a blanket agreement that the faculty are free to talk. They're under confidential disclosure agreements. The university will benefit from everything that they talk about. And so everyone gets a little bit of every success. Now, we don't have any of those yet, but there is a pre-competitive space, there's an overlap in a competitive space. Universities don't play well in this space because of conflict and money issues, but we can do well in the pre-competitive space. If you think about where the money is, the industry is spending last year $68 billion on drug development, and most of it is headed towards late phase 2 and phase 3. They're not spending money from discovery, new INDs, and so who's doing the basic research? NIH is, small biotech companies, startups, and universities. If you added up all the discovery dollars at the University of Minnesota, we get a couple $100 million of NIH grants, but the buildings and faculty are paid for by state money or clinic fees. I don't know that anyone's ever calculated the amount of money that's spent by all the public or private academic health institutions in the country, but it's got to be a really big number. And that intellectual product is available for partnering. And I think we should extract greater synergy of that public and private sector investment. And those of you that are my age might remember in the 80s, the microelectronics industry was about to collapse and lose computer chip making to Asian countries. And so they formed these pre-competitive consortia. And one of them that was extraordinarily successful was called Semitech. And they worked on things that were pre-competitive. What does that mean? Making a new gallium arsenide chip. And so it didn't matter if you were going to be Intel and you wanted to etch something or put transistors on it, that was competitive. But just making the silicon or gallium wafer was pre-competitive. So they formed a consortium with approval of the Federal Trade Commission, and they developed new methods of photolithography and etching. And we took back most of the market from the rest of the world in microelectronics, that early pre-competitive. And that model is a model that works in genomics. There's an established pre-competitive collaboration to stimulate genomics-driven product development. There's a pre-competitive collaboration consortium in oncology. This is a book published by the Institute of Medicine. There's a book called BioBazaar about open source revolutions in biotechnology. And we need to form collaborations on the pre-competitive side. The post-competitive side, we can play in that game, but you have to be careful. I have disclosure agreements. Dr. Sibley has disclosure agreements. We've appeared before the conflict committee, and we have full disclosure, but you have to do it or you'll be in trouble. This slide shows the number of new drug approvals by small companies, which is the green, and large companies in the blue. So yet another example of the decline in productivity of the traditionally large pharmaceutical companies, and small companies often started by faculty who left academic institutions to start a company because they had that nifty idea and were willing to put sweat equity and time into it. They didn't have necessarily a lot of money, but they had cleverness and creativeness. This slide shows that of the large pharmaceutical companies, what % of their drug sales are from products that were discovered by someone other than themselves. So more than half of current sales of the large pharmaceutical companies come from products that were invented elsewhere. If you look at Bristol Myers or Glaxo Lilly, if you add up their sales and trace back where did they come from, they came from someone outside of their institution. So the rule of thumb today is if you have a great phase 2A study, you can sell that for $200 to $400 million. That's the going price in the market for a proven medical innovation in pharmaceuticals. $200 to $400 million for a good phase 2 drug that works, really works, but it's also medically relevant. It's not me too. It solves an unmet medical need. It's not an incremental approval. It will qualify for an FDA priority review. This slide is, without externally discovered programs, few pharmaceutical companies would have any late-stage pipelines. It isn't that the percent of sales, is that if you look at a snapshot of today, 60% of the pipelines that are in development, they're derived from other than themselves. The biggest cuts that are occurring in the large pharmaceutical industry are to IND-ready pipeline products, or they have a zero tolerance for commercial risk and a higher wariness of downstream regulatory risk. No safety risk, no medical relevance risk, no early stuff. Early phase 2 and later, and they're willing to pay what I think are outrageous sums of money for things that are late. Where's an opportunity for an academic institution to make something that looks good at a phase 1 or a few patients in a phase 2? Pharmaceutical buyers are relentlessly scrutinizing for proof of relevance at all stages. If you got a third generation Prilosec, go home. It's not worth $5. But academic industry partnerships go back a long way. I mean, this is the classic tale of University of Toronto with the discovery of insulin. Frederick Banting and Charles Best discovered insulin, and they tried to extract it. But you all know the rest of the story, right? They couldn't do it. So they formed a private-public partnership before it was called that with Lilly to see if they could develop a manufacturing process for the extraction of insulin from animal organs. It's been one of the most successful drugs, or maybe is the most successful drug. And then in later years, 50, 60 years later, we had the recombinant DNA era that started with the Cohn-Boyer discoveries in the 70s, and cloning yielded production of Humulin, the first approved genetically engineered compound or biotechnology drug, I think in 1986, made by Genentech, produced by Lilly and marketed under the name Humulin. Now there's a number of them in the market, but this is really born out of academic discovery. A New England Journal article just a couple of years ago talked about the role of public sector research in the discovery of drugs and vaccines. And you don't need to read this, but in the last 40 years, there's 153 new FDA-approved drugs, vaccines, or new indications of existing drugs carried out by public research institutions. 93 are small molecule, 36 are biologics, and 15 vaccines. So the conclusion of the article is that public sector institutions can have a much more immediate impact on drug development. But there's a missing piece here. If you go read the article, that a highest percentage of priority review drugs originated from public research institutions. Priority review, the FDA has two types of reviews, priority and incremental. So most drugs get they're incremental improvements, and you really got something if you can get the FDA to give you a priority ranking. So 20% of the academically discovered drugs resulted in a priority review by FDA, more rapid approval, bigger unmet medical need, greater medical relevance. So to the extent that we're aware, pay attention to what we're doing, prove our science, we can play in that game. The thing that's being discussed now in industry is these things called open innovation networks. What are they? They're imperative for breakthrough therapies. What does it mean? and it's easy to talk about. Here's some examples. One company working with one investigator, one faculty member. One company with one university. Novartis with UCSF. Monsanto with Washington University. They're fraught with issues. But there are some. The ones that started in the 80s or 90s were subject to enormous criticism of conflict. But some of the ones today, they offer exquisite access to publication and free dialogue. One company, one university. One company supports a university consortium. One company supports a university institute. One company supports one product. One company, one research platform. There could be an industry consortium that supports a pre- or non-competitive application, developing a platform technology, a new way to clone, a new way to assay, high throughput screening. I mean, there are lots of things that occur in the non-competitive space that could be areas of collaboration that don't have this big burden of conflict. Competitive proposals, venture capital investments, or a fee for service. So, I see a friend of mine in the back who's a psychologist. I think he's still here. He's there. Psychology has a lot to do with this. Companies, and you can't read this, but I'll read it to you. Companies are more successful if they have an environment that promotes collaboration, effective project management and portfolio management, effective problem-solving approaches, talented teams, apprenticeship programs, structured mentoring, personal development plans. If you don't deal with the social skills of this, you don't make it. Companies that don't have good teamwork and social skills, and you can see that the green are the scores of successful companies and the brown are scores of companies that have not been successful. So you need to deal with interpersonal relationships and mentoring and coaching, or you can't be successful in this industry. These projects, even if an optimistic drug is 10, 11 years, and even if you make the costs far more cost effective, they're still $100 million. I mean, I can promise you I can develop a drug for $25 million in a niche indication. But it still takes years. It still takes 8 or 9 disciplines and 10 or 15 people. If that team doesn't get along, that doesn't work. So you got to pay attention to all the skills and all the factors. The landscape is shifting. Success will now be more stakeholders sitting at the table. I said that those 4 of us who went to Hopkins, they have 20 industry collaborations, but more importantly, they started an entrepreneur's boot camp, a Vine and Venture seminar, both among their own faculty and guest lecturers. Now, we started something here about 2.5 years ago. VID000 and I started a seminar where we brought in about 6 people from the private sector and done roundtables with faculty who wanted to meet with mentors. So we still have some money left. If someone has an idea for a good speaker, we'll be willing to sponsor someone. AstraZeneca has formed a large number of partnerships where they allow teaching, research, and service and publications, academic freedom, open discourse, but they get access to state-of-the-art biology and new drug candidates. I haven't seen that legal agreement, and we have several people here from the Office of Tech Transfer. It'd be nice to see some of those agreements. How do they allow free publication and teaching and service to occur in the face of those agreements? But I'll tell you that that's what big companies are willing to do. They were never willing to do it in the 80s and 90s and the early part of the last decade. But they have no choice now. They have no access to fresh ideas and intellectual property. So they're making sacrifices that were unheard of 10 or 20 years ago. They're willing to deal with publications and faculty scholarship because they have no choice. Merck has got collaborations across the world in target identification, target validation, screening of new molecules, small molecules and biologics, markers and diagnostics. And they're dealing with the same academic issues that I just mentioned in the previous case. Lilly might be one of the more transformative study cases. They used to call themselves a FIPCO, which stands for Fully Integrated Pharmaceutical Company. So we know that model's dead. If you want to be a fully integrated pharmaceutical company, you're going to die. You're going to die next couple of years or the next decade. So they have become a FIPNet, Fully Integrated Pharmaceutical Network. They have hundreds of collaborations with the idea that they're going to share the reward with lots of people. Better to have a little bit of money from a lot of inventions and discoveries than to try to have a lot of money of zero. And so they talk about their global network, common R&D goals, local execution, shared risk, and shared reward. And they have 1,000 different deal structures in there. They have coordinators as opposed to researchers. Getting people together, sharing over Skype and millions of ways to meet at meetings, at universities, meet at companies, meet at airports. Because the biggest missing link is ideas. Once you have an idea, the manufacturing, scaling, and selling, they can do that. They can't discover anything, though. So a few things here, and then I'm going to stop. Georg is right there. She started the Institute for Drug Development in 2007 to try to focus on new areas of drug discovery and development, training the next generation of drug discoverers. Where does this new IP come from? Scientific services for both the research and business community in drug discovery and development to enhance biomedical research at the University of Minnesota, open for business. Center for Translational Medicine, Bruce couldn't be here today, but Bob Schumacher, raise your hand in the back, is here from the Center for Translational Medicine. The CTM has got a service capability. They'll help you design your studies, help provide resources, help provide assay development, in vitro studies, preclinical models, proof of concept, single multiple dose, pharmacology, bioavailability. And so there is a place to go to. You don't have to do it alone. In fact, you can't do it alone. Not possible. So, and the last new program at the University of Minnesota is something that we started in January. Everybody from the Tech Transfer Office, raise your hand. So we started this program called the Committee for Pharmaceutical Development with $1.5 million from Tim Mulcahy and Aaron Friedman to try to give small seed grants to projects that are, as we say, within one step of a commercial transaction. Work with faculty. You have to have a development plan approved by outside industry advisors. There's no IP issues here with the external audience. This is totally a University of Minnesota undertaking. The advisors have signed a non-disclosure agreement. They'll be our exclusive advisors regarding that compound. I happen to be lucky enough to chair that. We have members from College of Pharmacy, CTM. We have 5 or 6 people from the private sector and venture capital, the Tech Transfer Office, Department of Medicine, Cancer Center. And so far, we're 6 weeks into it. I mean, we'll keep you posted. There's a website that's available. You can go to it. And there is a mechanism. Once we know that you have a patentable idea and you pass some medical relevance screen, you can apply with help for some seed grant. So the purpose is to improve the success rate of our therapeutic development program and commercialization here at the university. It's a 3-year pilot. There is a potential for matching funds. We think that the University of Minnesota Foundation is going to undertake an initiative to help Dean Speedy raise some money. Dean Speedy is right here. And the first priority will be a lead or repurposed molecule with convincing proof of concept. But there is this thing that occurs at universities. You know, universities get in trouble when they, I'm not going to read this, but the conflict of interest, you have to pay attention. We pay attention. We went a couple times in person. My friend Dan Saltzman, if you're here, went in person, has a clinical trial in a company. It's not hard to do, but you better do it, and you better do it early and often. Because academics get in trouble when they don't pay attention to the conflict rules. And this is a case you're going to see about. It's going to take years to unravel this case between Penn and the Memorial Sloan Kettering and some private sector donors. But what's my summary? Remember Moneyball. Get more drugs on first base. Shorten your cycle times. Improve your statistics. Social skills, partnering skills matter. Share risk and reward. No loners make it. Nobody in this business doing it alone can make it. If you run into somebody who says, I'm going to do it myself, run away. You have to optimize all critical elements, leave nothing to chance. Don't uncouple your science from your development. Don't shoot for the moon. Don't shoot for the moon. Fail early. Proof of concept. Proof of concept. It's the key risk reduction step, proof of relevance. Make sure that what you're doing is medically important. It will define your economic success. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions.
Thanks for a very interesting grand rounds. The Human Genome Project has opened the specter or the promise of personalized medicine. To me, this means that R&D and markets are going to change rapidly. So how will R&D change, and how will pharma respond to the sort of reduced market for individual focused drugs?
You know, it's the question that is really everyone talks about. The markets are going to shrink. They're going to be more targeted. You know, drugs like Herceptin, you know, really is kind of the personalized medicine. If you don't have the gene, you don't get the drug. And so I think that they're going to try to raise prices, and they've done that quite a bit, but there will be a limit with the payers. And I think that the future of the industry is going to be more personalized, more niche. I mean, as I gave grand rounds a couple years ago, I said that a glass of red wine a day only works if you're heterozygous for alcohol dehydrogenase. So most of the things we think of, broad population drugs, are going to turn out to be more subpopulations or groups or individualized. Markets are going to shrink by a lot. There's to be no more, in my opinion, $10 or $20 billion drugs.
I choose to think I'm one of the heterozygotes.
So you can either drink for medical effect or social effect.
Super talk, and related to Wes's question, in the field of antibiotics, as you know, our pipeline is dry or going to be dry. And an example that was really amazing to me was an antibiotic, trovafloxacin, fluoroquinolone, came out at the end of the 90s, and it was tested in 5,000 people, totally safe, before they went to no other antibiotic had that kind of testing. Got into the market because it was active against so many infections. Within a year, they had 1 million patients treated, and all of a sudden, they saw very rare liver toxicity. It was probably 1 in 100,000 people, but because of that, this very wonderful antibiotic for almost everybody was essentially removed from the market. It was a blockbuster in its first year. And so, related to Wes's question, if you had the ability to find out the genetic basis for that toxicity, that would be a huge benefit because that antibiotic probably was safer than penicillin. The tolerance of risk, you know, the general public doesn't understand that risk-benefit issue, right? And
that's right.
That's a question. Is the pharmaceutical industry going to use genomics to try to eliminate these toxicities that kill very good drugs like trovafloxacin?
Yeah, I think that's an obvious place to find, if you can find the genomic typing for those high-risk situations. There was another fluoroquinolone 5 or 10 years earlier than that came off the market due to anaphylactic shock in 1 of 100,000. Was that an Abbott drug? What was the name of that drug? Was it oxfloxacin? Oxfloxacin hit 200,000 or 300,000 people, and it was pulled 3 months after launch due to a 1 in 50,000 allergic reaction. So, I mean, you can't test for that with any known method. But maybe there is a genetic test that would predict that. I mean, you see these in lots of other drugs, in azathioprine and 5-FU. You see these things, and maybe they're testable, and maybe that's a place for a genomic test.
Jordan?
I unfortunately made the mistake of discovering the cause of Alzheimer's disease. And that's been a millstone around my neck. I have patented the idea. And I find that the pharmaceutical industry, in spite of the fact that at the present time, Lilly, for example, is threatened with being bought up by Abbott, because the fact is that they're testing a drug which everybody believes isn't going to work. I find that these people don't seem to have any vision. And this has been my experience in dealing with a number of companies, including Lilly. And I think that the big problem comes down to is that they're not interested in innovation. They want to pick up what somebody's already innovated, which means that for me to get my idea into the market, I have to get venture capital, who will basically take most of my equity, and I haven't been able to even generate that kind of thing. So I think that this is a much bigger problem, and it's related to the fact that our industries really are stuck with the NIH, not the National Institutes of Health, but not invented here, and that these people do contact with academics who may or may not know what's going on.
Well, I think maybe that's kind of